This is one of my hardest builds on my tightest deadline ever, where almost everything that could go wrong does, but it might just be one of the coolest things I've ever made. So let's build a turtle. As always, we've got to kick things off with a scale diagram, so I at least sort of know what I'm doing. Here I'm focusing on the shell, as that's what I'm going to be building first. After a bit of off-camera work and some unfortunate pencil abuse, I decided I wanted to trace the shell design to make a 3D template. Unfortunately, I managed to momentarily blind myself not once, not twice, but 3 times here. Once I was done, I had a good base cut out to work off. A useful tip here is if you fold the design in half, you can easily see if it's symmetrical or not. Now, the plan here is going to be that I build the shell out of circuit board segments, but to do that, I need to know the size and shape of each segment before I cut them out. And given that the shell is going to be 3D and curved, it's not really something I can wing. I'm cutting out different segments here with apparently the worst posture in the world. I mean, seriously, what the hell is that? I have a height adjustable standing desk. There's no reason for my neck to be doing that. Anyway, spinal issues aside, I had all of the sections I wanted cut, and with a combination of blue tack and sellotape, I started building them up into a 3D structure. I actually thought this looked pretty cool already, but it had ended up a pretty different shape to the original template I made, so I retraced a new structure onto my base. I need to make what's basically a metal scaffolding to fit all of the circuit board segments into, so I'm starting to measure and cut these welding rods into different sections that match the segment lengths. Some of these cross the midline, so need to be bent down the middle, and I could already tell getting this entire thing to be even vaguely symmetrical was going to be a bit of a nightmare. But if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know my build process could be summed up like that pretty much every time, so I'm kind of used to it by now. With the outer edge bent and cut to size, it was time to start working on some physical building. I've got the rods stuck to my template, and with the welded freehand, I was able to get it welded pretty easily. It fit with the paper shell, so I went ahead and strengthened all the joints up through the microscope. I'm adding this sort of spine to the shell for now, just as a way to keep the template fixed in place and provide a starting point in getting this 3D. Once that was welded in place, you could see the vague structure the shell will have, and I was happy with the size and shape. The template slipped in easily, and it was time to start matching the rods I had cut the size earlier, following the lines of each segment. This actually started off way less painful than I thought it was going to be, which is unusual because I don't normally get things right the first time. The template made it really easy to cut the rods to the right length and just add them in one at a time, making sure each side matched. Now, given this was going well, I apparently got cocky and thought I could just remove the template and start doing this freehand. This was a mistake, and I will pay for it later. Unfortunately, another thing I decided to pay later was my electricity bill, and my power got shut off mid-weld. This is a semi-regular occurrence and not the first video this has happened in, and I fear furthers the starving artist stereotype. One emergency top-up later, we were back in business, and for some reason I decided the least natural looking thumbs up ever would be a good way to reassure the audience. When I went and checked everything was fitting with the template, I saw, as usual, I'm not as capable as I think I am, and I'd screwed up. This didn't match at all, and it shifted half of the segments out of alignment, so I had to now undo a not insignificant amount of work. We can just pretend this was really quick and fun to do, and didn't irritate me at all. Once I'd made those changes, we were back on track, and I managed to fill in the rest of the skeleton without too much pain. Well, emotional pain. Physically, yeah, it was quite painful.
Ah! Fuck.
The burns were worth it though, because it actually looked really cool now that I'd finished it. And once I'd removed the spine piece, I went around making sure every single weld was really strong. This really isn't a stage worth skipping because I've spent hours on it at this point, and I really don't want to come back and fix a broken connection later down the line. This is one of the downsides of my welder. It's great because I can make incredibly precise and tiny welds that let me get a really clean look to my pieces without ruining the small electronic components I use. But when the welds are tiny, it means you need a lot of them to make things strong. If I had a bigger welder, this would only take like 1 weld per joint, and after about 30 spot welds and some grinding, I'd be done. But in this scenario, each little joint is probably going to take me about 50 welds just to be sure that it's going to be strong enough. Once I'd made what felt like at least 1,000 welds, I put it through a rigorous strength test to check for any faults. This mainly involved throwing it around a bit and continuing the trend of the least nonchalant thumbs up ever to indicate it passed. Now, I need to make sure that the circuit board segments fit completely flush with the skeleton, but this is going to be pretty tricky, given the circuit boards will be flat while I cut them out, but need to be bent for their final fitting. To make sure I was getting the cutting templates perfect, I'm pressing paper up against the skeleton so it's bent, and tracing the edges in that position. This I'm hoping should mean it will fit when things are all said and done. The paper fits in, so I don't really see any reason why the circuit boards won't, although some segments were much harder to trace than others, so I'm sure there'll be some hiccups later down the line. With all the templates cut and labelled, it's time to get some circuit boards involved. I want to use a really bright green and ideally have all the segments coming from the same board. Typically, the one I wanted to use was too small, but after finding two that matched pretty well and a little bit of Tetris, I found a way to fit all the parts except one onto the main board. I had to spend a little time cleaning up the boards, but I was finally ready to start cutting. It was very hot out and apparently I failed in my attempts to keep my toes off camera, so those are definitely getting censored. You're not seeing that for free here, that's what Patreon's for. To be clear, that is definitely not what my Patreon is for. I'm using a Dremel to cut out the segments, trying to get as close to the edge as possible. This isn't exactly the best setup I could have. Ideally I'd have a little bandsaw to be doing this, but it does the job. I started being a bit more careful with my hand placement after giving my thumb a close shave that surprisingly left it unscathed. This looks like it was quick to do, but I do just want you all to know that it really wasn't, in part due to my butterfingers and repeated dropping of pieces for seemingly no reason. Once they were all cut as close as I could get with my fingers intact, I used my bench sander to get as close as possible to the template. This was a bit tricky for the concave parts and I had to go back to using various Dremel attachments, but between techniques I managed a pretty good job of it. With all the segments cut, it was time to start bending. Now, I've never bent circuit boards before. In fact, I wasn't really sure if I was going to be able to do it without them cracking or snapping. I figured the only way I'd be able to do it was with a heat gun, and there was only one way to find out. I used a Sharpie to mark the lines where I'd be bending and just gave it a go. This actually seemed to be working and I was getting pretty excited. I wasn't getting it perfect first try though, and it was constantly checking against the skeleton to make small adjustments. One downside was that the circuit boards were unsurprisingly getting very hot. And the gloves that my comment sections are always so desperate for me to wear weren't quite cutting it, so I started using some pliers to help. You might have noticed that the heat gun was sounding less and less happy, something I hadn't been paying attention to at all. It had turned itself off, which I thought was slightly odd, and realised that after about 10 minutes of use the battery was completely drained. My attempts to get it to keep going did not work. I'd left the battery charger at home, and so far I had only managed to bend 1.5 pieces, so this really wasn't ideal. It's also worth mentioning that I had an incredibly short deadline for this piece. His Instagram had commissioned me to build it so they could share a reel of the process on their design page, so losing any time was a serious setback. Luckily I hid my frustration well, and tried to think of something more useful to do in the meantime. The central rod in the shell was actually blocking where I needed to add some of the segments, so I altered that by adding in new support lines and cutting out the parts that intersected. This meant that with a bit of grinding off camera, I could test the fit of the segment, which, if I do say so myself, looked kind of amazing. I really wanted to shove some more in, but I had to curb my enthusiasm and suited up the next day to carry on. With the battery fully charged, I was able to get a few more pieces bent, but did suffer some physical pain for them. I upgraded the gloves in the hopes of saving my skin, but as is often the case with PPE, I lost enough dexterity that I decided burning myself was actually preferable. Every time I would bend the pieces, I needed to sand them down to try and make everything fit really flush. I used a combination of the Dremel, sander, and just regular old sandpaper to get this done. The Dremel and sander take quite a lot of material off quickly, so if something really wasn't fitting, I'd use those, but turn to sandpaper when I needed to be a bit more delicate. This was an incredibly slow and boring process that took far too long, so it almost feels like a disservice editing it to make it look speedy and snappy. I genuinely believe that my audience should experience a fraction of my suffering, although this could potentially hurt the views. Let me know your thoughts on that. It also really didn't help that the battery still drained incredibly fast, so I was only going to be able to get a few segments done at a time before needing to charge it up for another hour. London was also experiencing a heat wave at the time, and my unventilated windowless studio was already pretty toasty before I started introducing a ton of heat into the room. So if you see me sweating, then no you didn't. Anyway, I've spent enough time moaning now, and despite it being a bit of a painful process, it was looking really cool and actually working way better than I thought it would. With all the segments bent and fitting into place, it actually looked like a proper shell. If turtles were made out of electronics, that is. Given I hadn't even been sure that the circuit boards could bend, this was basically the dream scenario, and now all I needed to do was make it strong. I figured the only real way to do this was to introduce some metals so that I could weld the segments in place. I used my pillar drill to make some 3mm holes in key spots and then hammered some 4mm wide nails through the holes so that they fit really tight. Before I went and did this to every segment, I figured it was probably a good idea to see if this worked, so went over to weld those in place using small nails to join the segment nails to the shell skeleton. Once they were attached, I could cut them down as short as possible so they wouldn't be in the way of everything else. This worked as well as it needed to, and seeing as I couldn't think of anything better, I went to repeat the same process for all the segments. So it turns out, attaching your camera to the desk the very rattly pillar drill sits on is a great way to make your footage unusable. Luckily, my second setup sat on more stable footing, so the whole process wasn't a total write-off. After lots of drilling came lots and lots of hammering. Each segment had about 4 to 5 holes, so after drilling about 60 holes, I had to hammer 60 nails into place. Incredibly, I only managed to smash my thumb about twice. After that was all done, I had the very tedious task of welding everything into place. And if you're wondering why there's masking tape on my top, it's because I got a takeaway pizza for dinner and managed to drop it all over my top. For some reason I thought this would be a subtle fix, but watching this back, clearly not the case. This took me an unbelievable amount of time. I was at it until about 1 AM when I just had to give up and come back the next day to finish it off. This got a bit harder to do as I added more pieces, because the angles were worse to weld the more concave the area was. But slowly I was... Are you even listening? No one's at the door. Okay, sorry. Leave a like and I won't do that again. Anyway, like I said, slowly but surely I was knitting it all together into a web of metal. Eventually I was done and gave it a nice standardized strength test by throwing it around as usual. Everything seemed to work, so we finally had our shell. At the time, I felt like this was going to be the worst bit to build, so I was really happy to have it out of the way. I was wrong, of course, but that would be for future Zach to discover. One thing I did still need to amend was the shell had gotten much thinner than my original design, so I needed to widen it a bit and give it less of a perfectly flat shape. After some bending and shaping, I had 2 symmetrical-ish bits of wire ready to weld together. I hope you can ignore that I'm aggressively chewing on some sweets here. I removed the audio out of courtesy. This is not going to be an ASMR channel anytime soon. I welded that up and made sure I hadn't ruined the angles. A mistake that I've made many times before, and welded a nail to the top that would let me attach to the rest of the shell. I snipped that down to the length that worked and welded it in place. I used a couple of small nails to add some more joints further down so it wouldn't fall apart at the first sign of trouble. Happy I'd managed to line everything up, I went around and made sure everything was strong, which it clearly wasn't, but once I'd repaired that, everything felt fairly well fixed in place. Now, you might have noticed the gap at the bottom. This is because I did my measuring wrong, so everything was too short. I'll just have to add an extra piece in later. Given I was going to need to attach a head and 4 flippers to the shell at some point, I figured I needed to build up the structure, so added even more scaffolding to use as anchor points later. Once I'd filled the gap below, it looked pretty good, and I just gave everything a once over to make it really strong. I like how the welding flashes light up the shell here. It could make a cool lamp. I threw on some more scaffolding, specifically focusing on the areas I'd be adding the fins later. The circuit boards are really the heart of this piece. I honestly think they're one of the most beautiful and visually stunning materials to work with, which is why they're featured in so many of my sculptures. There's not much that brings me more joy than cracking open a broken device and seeing these incredible feats of engineering hidden away inside. I honestly have no idea how people managed to build them, which brings me to the sponsor of this video, PCBWay. With a wide range of manufacturing capabilities and diversity of services, including advanced PCB manufacturing and assembly, 3D printing, CNC machining, and sheet metal fabrication, they offer a truly one-stop shop for makers and innovators at any scale. So if you want to build something cool, visit PCBWay.com. There was still some more work to do here, considering the shell had a big gap going all the way around that needed to be filled in, but for now, it was just time to start building the head. The head was always going to be tricky. I think people actually have a fairly good idea of what Tesla's heads look like, so if I get it wrong, it's going to be noticeable. I've figured out what I think is a good scale and chosen a part that I think will work, but it needs some modifications first. I used my angle grinder to cut these spokes off and smoothed everything over with the Dremel. I also threw in a bit of a bend, so it had a slight curve to it, and brought the point to a taper which fit better with the shape I was going for. At this point, I really didn't know what other parts to use, and was testing different pieces out before finding one that I thought could work pretty well as a lower jaw. The top piece was still a bit too boxy for my liking, so I shaved off some more material from each side and then took it over to my desk sander to get a nice smooth look, which I did very competently and safely of course. Well, one issue was the lower jaw and upper part of the head were quite different diameters, so it didn't really fit together how I wanted. I added a bit of a welding rod that was the right diameter and added that to the jaw. I'd be able to weld another one to this that mimicked the shape and size I wanted the head to be, and hope from there I could just tie everything in together.
Ow.
I messed around with some other parts before committing to this though, as I didn't feel very confident in where this was going at all. Sometimes the parts just don't feel right, and normally when this happens I can start to really second guess myself, and usually have to take some time away from the build to get over this artist block. That was not an option here though, as I was very much already running out of time on this commission, so after messing around with some parts that definitely weren't right, I snapped them off and got the inklings of a new idea. I needed to build the beak that turtles have, so started cutting a template out card. After a bit of testing and a few revisions, I had a shape that I liked, so now I just had to cut it out of metal instead of paper. I found a piece that worked, and using the template was able to do a pretty good job of replicating it. I curved this to match the head shape rod from earlier, and after about half an hour of procrastination and doubts, decided to just commit and join them together. This was actually quite hard to do. The metal was very thin, so I had to keep the welding power really low to prevent it eating completely through the piece. While that worked, it meant that the welds were harder to get strong, as I was getting less penetration with each one. My first attempts at this didn't work at all, but eventually I managed to figure it out. That being said, it did take about 1,000,000 welds to get it done. I did my usual checks to make sure everything looked okay together and started to sand down the edge flush with the rod. I realised this was going to take way too long and cut the bulk of it down with scissors before using my Dremel for the final touches. This was then followed by another 1,000,000 welds until I was satisfied that it wasn't going to fall apart. I know I say this a lot, but I really did this part of the head wrong. It comes back to bite me in a big way later, and I had to waste a ton of time fixing it, but right now I'm blissfully unaware, so don't even worry about it. After performing minor surgery on my superglue, I added this part to the lower jaw to bulk it out. It wasn't quite the right size or shape, as sea turtles have much smaller jaws than this part made it, but they're also not made out of metal, so I hope you can suspend your disbelief just a little. I bent a welding rod into a little turtley shape and welded that to it. This kind of helped bring the shape back into something I was happier with. Even though it was much thinner than the rest of the lower jaw, I felt it gave the illusion of everything being a bit slimmer.
Mother.
I also made some alterations with the Dremel to get rid of some of the boxier bits here, which definitely helped things a lot. I bulked out the structure. Given that one of the main parts here had been only superglued on, I needed to make some scaffolding to pin it in place. With that strong enough now, I was finally ready to combine a bit of upper and lower jaw, welding the beak section on. Hopefully this is starting to look a little bit turtley-chewy now, but honestly, even I still wasn't completely on board with how it was going at this stage. I tested out some potential eyes, and while I didn't really love how everything was looking, I was also really running out of time and didn't have any better ideas, so welded everything together well enough that it would be a right pain to try and remove it later. Which it was. The head still needed bulking up, so I added some more parts on and carried on testing, trying to figure out what else could work. I'd found a couple of cool parts out my studio in the car park where I ate my pizza the other night, and they actually seemed like a good fit, so I added those on. This part seemed like it would work well as a neck of sorts, and would help me attach the head section at the right height. It didn't quite fit how I needed it to, but after adding a little nut, it looked like it would work better. But while I was comparing this all, I decided the beak section was a bit too fat, so shaved it down until it had a better fit. Happy with how this looked, I went to weld it in place, but in what felt like a sign from some sort of scrap metal higher power, this didn't work and prompted me to realise I was actually not happy with how this looked. The welding rod at the base of the beak almost looked like lips, and I kinda hated it, which means I was going to have to take several painful steps backwards. While I didn't like the look of the rod, I did need it for the structure of the head. What I needed to do was have it on the other side so that you just couldn't see it. This meant I had to redo the very tedious welding until the new rod was properly secured. Really, it would have been quicker to just start again, but I didn't have any more of the metal I'd used, and I didn't think of doing that until now. Now, you might be thinking, how are you going to remove the old rod without breaking the very delicate setup you spent ages making now? And the answer is very slowly grinding it away into nothingness. Honestly, looking back, this hug was really not one of my best moments, and that's saying something because I make a lot of mistakes in these videos. I had to crack out the gloves because all this grinding was making things incredibly hot. This probably took me like an hour, and I was so nervous the entire time that I'd go too far and eat straight through the very thin beak metal and have just ruined the whole thing. Luckily, eventually we got there and it looked way better than before. So I got it back attached, and 2 hours later, we were back where we started. This time the gods must have been smiling on me as I managed to get all the other parts attached nicely. At this point I was feeling a bit more positive. I still didn't love how it looked, but it looked much more like a Tesla than before, and I was pretty sure I knew what would make it look way better. The eyes. The eyes are always one of the most important parts of a build. People tend to focus on eyes, call it human nature, so if you get them wrong, everyone notices. I had these bolts which were a good size, and the plan was to build some eyelids that would give them that distinctive turtle look. I coloured in one of the bolts black, which looked way better, but obviously not exactly to the standard I was looking for. I figured spray paint would work better than Sharpie, so sanded down the face a bit with some 800 grit so the paint would stick a little easier. You might be able to tell I'm not very familiar with spray paint, but after a quick inspection and a touch up, I repeated the process on the second one. I thought this smiley face would look cool for the video, but kind of bungled it if I'm honest. With those drying, I needed to make the eyelids. This was going to be much harder. I found them pretty fiddly to cut out of paper, so repeating the process on metal wasn't seeming very appealing. I prepared the bit of metal I'd chosen and duplicated the paper templates to make sure I had enough material to make all 4 out of the same part. I thought a good way to attach these would be to just sellotape them in place. This worked pretty well at first, and I roughly cut each one out with my scissors. It was clear by now that I'd never be able to cut them out neatly and nicely with these though, so once again found myself turning to my Dremel to grind them down into shape. These were really tricky to hold because as well as being tiny, they were getting very, very hot. At first I tried holding them in pliers, but this just wasn't cutting it. In fact, the sellotape situation also just wasn't working very well, so instead I used a Sharpie to trace the shape on, meaning I just had to remove all the coloured in bits to get the shape I needed. This, while very fiddly, did actually work, and I repeated the process on the others. My gloves did not survive this ordeal unscathed, as the very hot, sharp slivers of metal just cut straight through them like a hot knife through, well, gloves I guess. But their sacrifice was very appreciated because for once things were looking exactly how I wanted them. I bent each one so they fit the curve of the eye bolts and made sure they looked good before getting started on the next tricky bit. I needed to weld these together, but again, the metal here was so thin and friable, I had to be really careful to not melt right through it. Given that I'd just spent about an hour making these, the thought of ruining them was basically stressing me out more than anything else so far in the build. I did somehow manage to make this work, and we finally had 2 eyes ready to get attached to the head. Now, to actually get these guys added on, I was going to need to chop the bolts down a lot. And frankly, I probably should have done this before spray painting them for reasons that will soon become clear, but here we are. I didn't want to cut all the way through and have any of the paint chip or scuff off, so I was really careful here with my hand slightly precariously positioned to catch it if it did. I managed to time this one perfectly and was ready to repeat the process on the other side. Unfortunately, I was getting some kickback on the grinder here, which made me start imagining slicing my fingers off. The fear meant I moved my catching hand out of the danger zone, assuming I could just repeat the perfect, not quite cut I did on the last one. An assumption that was wrong. Obviously this chipped the paint exactly like I feared, and after trying to respray it and not waiting long enough for it to dry and just generally ruining it, I had to go whip up another one. This time I decided to cut it before spraying to avoid doing the same thing, and obviously managed to cut it perfectly this time. I went and sprayed it and slightly ruined some tweezers, but we had 2 eyes again-ish, so all's well that middle's well I suppose. It was time to go back to the head, and I welded a couple of washers on in a few spots so that I'd have somewhere to nestle some nice goldenly looking screws, as I felt the head was a bit too overwhelmingly silver at this point. I cut the heads of the screws off and then super glued them in place. This is because the coating on the screws means that if I try and weld them, I'll get a lot of discoloration and frankly a bad weld, so given they're not playing any sort of structural role, super glue should do the job. I also added a few little supports here and there because I'd kept the head pretty minimalistic so far, and while I liked the look of all the negative space, it did mean that the few connections I had needed to be really strong to make up for it. Okay, you might think I'm jumping around here a bit, the eyes, the head, the body, but A, I'm still waiting for the freshly sprayed eye to dry, and B, I'm indecisive, and it was like 2 AM, so I wasn't exactly on top form. Either way, I needed to get some structure going on the bottom of the body. This part seemed good at first, but I quickly discovered it was unweldable, so instead used some of the holes already present to bolt some weldable material in, namely the bolts themselves. I welded the nuts and bolts together so they wouldn't go anywhere and added a welding rod between them just to give me some more options for connection points. I used a speaker to prop this up at the height I wanted and welded a nail between the shell and one of the weldable bolts. This held things in place nicely so I could add in more supports and start making things a bit stronger. Apparently I got about halfway through this process and then realised it was 3 AM and I was about to fall asleep, so checked things looked okay-ish and then just skedaddled for the night. When I returned in the morning, I decided that this head needed some eyes as a matter of urgency and went about figuring out how to attach them. I needed a way to attach the eyes from within because I didn't want any welding on the edges that would spoil the look of them. Luckily, because I'd chopped straight through them earlier, I had some exposed ungalvanized metal to work with. I took a nail and welded it to the back of the eye, bent it into shape and then tentatively welded the nail to the rest of the head. This looked pretty good, so I reinforced the weld and added some more nails in to just get extra support in place. I repeated the process on the other side without too much of a struggle and went to go over everything to make it really strong, which is when the real trouble started. You might notice that my welder is not welding, which is kind of its whole thing. I messed around with the settings and tried a few different materials, but was having absolutely no luck here. I swapped the electrode, rebooted and updated the system, none of which worked. I was already behind schedule with the piece due in days and now no welder. This is bad.
Now I'm panicking.
Yeah, don't panic.
No, I am, because I'm going to lose my job.
After digging through my studio, I found a different ground electrode that I could try, which is really my last hope. If this doesn't work, I'm completely screwed. Thankfully it did.
Oh, thank fuck.
I have no idea why my other ground electrodes just completely stopped working out of the blue, but frankly I was just insanely relieved that I could still weld. That being said, the new ground electrode was a tad unwieldy and took some getting used to. But at the end of the day it worked, so really that's all that mattered. With eyes attached, I was getting quite excited, literally clicking with joy. The eyelids wouldn't weld to the spray painted metals, so I just super glued them on instead. This pretty instantly made the head look a million times better, and I went to repeat this on the other side, making sure I got it symmetrical. Oh, wait, no I didn't. Luckily I quickly removed it before it had time to properly bond to the eye.
Shit.
Oh wait, no I didn't. I started desperately searching for one of the million Stanley blades I kept lying around the place to pry it off, but apparently they'd all gone into hiding. By the time I found one, the eyelids were well and truly stuck, and now I had to be really careful to not A, break them, and B, damage or chip the spray paint when trying to remove it. Thankfully, I was actually able to do this, and re-glued them on this time, actually checking it was right before. This is probably the first time I'd been happy with the build in a while, and I just really loved how the head had come together, but now it was back to the shell. Picking up where I left off the other night, I still had to strengthen up the connections here. I also quickly remembered why I'd given up last time, as the angles here meant I wasn't properly able to weld inside the shell easily.
Oh my god.
After what was quite a lot of trial and error,
Oh, fuck my life.
I did manage to make something work. Let's just say I didn't exactly fall in love with the process. After a short break, I came back much happier apparently, whistling and humming so badly that even I can't tell what song I'm trying to recreate. If you can figure it out, let me know in the comments and I'll give you, well, nothing of value but respect, I guess. I'm testing out some parts here that I found in the street a few days ago. It seemed too serendipitous to find a box of metal midway through a build and not use some of the parts in it, so I was trying to figure out how to incorporate them in a way that made sense. While I let the ideas marinate for a bit, it was time to get back to the bit of the shell I'd been avoiding. The empty rim around the edge needed to be filled in, and I had the idea of using green circuit board components to do that. I thought this would look great, but also be a bit of a pain to do. I removed any nails that would get in the way, trying my best to not remove anything that was structurally important by accident. With that sorted, I needed to select different sized ones to match the widths all the way around the edge. This ended up being pretty fiddly, but luckily I had a ton of different sizes to choose from, and ones that didn't quite fit, I just sanded down until they would. It probably took me a couple of hours, so I decided not to bore you with the dragged out process, but was really pleased with how it turned out. Now it's time for the flippers. Turtle flippers are actually slightly weirder shapes than I'd imagined, so it took a few goes to get my template designs right. I'd found a good part to kick things off on the lower flippers, but quickly ran out of ideas there and moved on to the upper pair. I started messing around with some parts I'd selected, trying to find a way to fit them together and came up with a pretty good base. I needed to add a bit more of a curve to it though, so bent this long part slightly and it was starting to give a hint of a flipper-esque structure. I went over to weld this up, but was struggling to get everything to balance properly before realizing I was being stupid and should just weld one side at a time rather than trying to hold the entire thing together at once. Once that was done, I needed to make sure this was symmetrical and held the gas canister at the right angles, so set it up on my desk and took the welder freehand. This made it a lot easier than trying to hold everything in the air with all the hands I don't have keeping everything in place. Now, the canister isn't actually welded at this point, so I added some more supports to the metal to make sure it wouldn't fall apart. I was doing this because I could tell there was probably only going to be one good point to weld the canister, as it didn't line up great with the other bits of metal. So I'm trying to add strength that isn't dependent on that before I get around to adding it. The metal section that I'd be building the curve out of had a ridge running down one side, which would make them asymmetrical as they look flipped, pun intended, when they were on the opposite side, so I drew on some alterations and took them over to my sander. This pretty quickly tore through my decrepit sandpaper, so I swapped it for a new one. The metal was getting very hot and pretty quickly tore through the skin on my fingers too, so I grabbed my gloves to avoid the inevitable comments from the glove lobby. Once those were done, I went back and started welding the canister in place. You can see here I really only got one good weld on each side, so to make sure I was covering all my bases, I took a nail and after welding it from one edge, bent it over the canister to weld it from the other side. This held it in place really nicely and also helped with attaching the curve section. Once that was welded in place, I threw in some more nails to make sure everything was really strong. Again, curving a few here and there so that I could weld from the strongest points. I also felt like having a few curved lines here rather than all of them being dead straight was a bit more natural looking and gave the impression of something streamlined for water traversal a bit better. I carried on adding parts, building up the lower section of the flipper, making sure it all followed the angles and proportions of my template. I liked how this was looking with the body, but at the moment it was very much barely held together, with a lot of gaps and empty space. I threw in some nails for structure and had something that was starting to look pretty cool. I repeated this and whipped up the second one to match, making sure I got the same angles and proportions for each part. I found some parts that worked well for building the curve of the shoulder. Importantly, because I wanted this to be symmetrical, I need 2 of every part I find to be able to use it. There were lots of parts that would have been great that I couldn't use because I only had the one piece. I do love using recycled and salvaged materials to make my art, but it definitely does make things tricky at times. After getting the shoulder parts attached and making sure both sides were again symmetrical, I was playing around with the fact that these parts moved, which gave me an idea. The kind of idea that takes way more work for basically zero reward. The kind of idea I probably shouldn't be having when I'm massively behind schedule with a deadline imminently arriving. Unfortunately though, I had the idea. You can probably guess what it might involve, but while that's percolating, I went back to working on the body as I still needed some structure to attach to flippers to. I still really wanted to use those parts I'd found and started figuring out how to make that happen. The parts were all weldable, but the middle section of metal I'd already added on obviously wasn't, so I had to super glue the parts to it first and then weld them to the rest of the structure once they were in place. I also needed a way to attach the head. I had this great part that was the perfect diameter to match the head, so welded that onto the body as well, using nails to make sure there were lots of points of connection. You can see the head fits in really nicely here, which would make attaching it way easier, or so I thought at least. I checked this positioning with the flipper to try and get an idea of how it was all going to look when it was together and seemed pretty happy with things. There was still a big gap in the body right where I'd need to join the flippers, so I started adding in some large nails to tackle that issue. You can see here I'm not really adding in massive bits of metal. It's more of a patchwork effect where I'm only adding structure where I need it. You could argue that this is because I was running out of parts that worked, but you could also argue it looks kind of cool, so I don't know, argue in the comments I guess. Let me know if you like the negative space or if you think I should have filled this in more. After a reasonably painful burn, I felt like it was a good time to call it a day. Now, when I compared the body with the head, I felt it looked a bit stubby. Also, I'd googled some pictures of turtles last night and they actually do in fact have necks, whereas this guy isn't looking like he'll be mistaken for a giraffe anytime soon. This meant I was going to have to extend the neck, so my whole idea of having this perfect fit between the head and the body connection was now pointless and entirely moot. I took a nail and welded it to the base of the head, and after making sure that it looked reasonably good, welded it on properly. Now, I needed to actually attach it to the body, which I was not finding easy as I tried to hold both parts in the perfect position while only being able to look through the microscope. I managed to get one weld in, but could tell this wasn't even close to being strong enough to support the weight of the head. So I had to try and hold everything together in one hand while I grabbed another nail to add more connections. I did actually manage to do this without dropping the entire thing, which was very surprising to me, and I was able to add some more connections and get the whole thing strong enough that I could let go. Unfortunately, what I had got wrong was the neck length. It was in fact too long now. I didn't feel like undoing everything and redoing that rather painstaking process, so instead cut the neck off and just removed a vertebra or two. I ground down both cuts so that I'd have a good flat surface to re-weld, and once I had an angle I was happy with, welded it back in place. This fits so much better, and I set off adding in some more nails to get it strong enough that I'd stop worrying it was going to fall apart. Some of these I got pretty wrong and had to redo, which I found very stressful because I was sure my attempts to remove them was going to break the whole thing. But luckily this didn't happen, and all in all it actually went pretty well. I really liked how this was looking. Something about getting the head and body attached made me feel like there was some actual progress. For ages I'd been making separate parts and it didn't feel like the turtle was actually getting any more turtly, whereas now we're finally starting to get somewhere.
Yow!
I've also been working on my Tom and Jerry scream impression.
God damn it.
I was still nervous this wasn't going to be strong enough given how little there was in terms of connections though, so went around bulking it up until I could rest a little easier. Now that I'd spent a while working on the head though, it was time to get back to that idea I'd had. Yeah, you guessed it, I want to be able to move the flippers. To do this I need some big hinges, something I don't have, which means it's something I need to make. I've got a few of these parts here and I think I can modify them to produce some hinge components. I went to cut this with my angle grinder but seemingly got spooked and flipped it round before happily continuing to cut. Can't say I remember why I did this, but I'm sure it was all very clever at the time. You can see here I'm being very careful to not burn myself with these parts, as I know all too well how hot metal can be when you've been cutting it. Once I had the parts separated, I used a combo of angle grinder and Dremel to get rid of some of the excess material. Now, apparently I got a bit complacent here because working on the second one, that whole don't touch it with your fingers thing apparently went out the window.
Mother!
This man was actually a really painful one, and you'll notice I'm diligently wearing gloves after this. I finished up on the desk sander to make sure everything was straight and neat. Now, hopefully you can see where I'm going with these hinges. I'm going to use two of these picture frame hangers to act as the bendy part, and the metal as the attachment points for the body. These obviously have to be really strong, so I made sure to weld every available millimeter of space on both of them. Not sure what I'm doing here, but after the turtle got a back massage, I was ready to join the other half of the hinge. Now this needs to be really precise. I need it to be straight and spaced properly apart, so I'm going to go freehand, hence the welding glasses in serious need of an upgrade. I used some blue tack to secure the parts in place how I wanted and started welding. You might notice that I'm closing my eyes here for each weld, and that's because these glasses have about an 85% success rate of actually darkening, so I'm not taking any chances. Aside from the whole using bad and broken glasses to protect my very valuable eyes chance, of course. Either way, this worked, and the only casualty was the burns to my mat. I took the hinge under the microscope to make sure everything was as strong as it could be, and checked to see what the actual hinge action was like.
Oh, that's so good.
The answer was pretty damn good, so I whipped up a second one, and it was time to actually get them attached. It was pretty easy to weld the flipper side. I'd chosen the metal bit so it would fit properly, and it just slotted nicely alongside the nail I had in place already. I made sure this still moved nicely, and satisfied it did, welded the hell out of it. Given this would be getting a lot of play, it needed to be stronger than if it was a static part, so I had to make it as strong as possible, which meant about 1,000,000 welds. With it firmly in place, I repeated the join on the other flipper and made sure I got both symmetrical as usual. Now, the real challenge was going to actually be attaching them to the body. This didn't have the same easy place to slot in like before, and I still didn't really know what angle to fix them at. After a bit of playing around, I felt I found a good one, so went to weld it in place, just weakly in case I got in it wrong. Maybe a bit too weakly. This was going to be harder than I'd predicted, so clearly I started procrastinating. I'd wanted to add a couple of parts to the flippers to cover up the hinge, and decided this would actually be easier to do before attaching them to the body. I grabbed a couple of washers, as well as some other parts for lower down the flipper, and started attaching everything. Maybe one day I'll be able to make a build that's super linear with a nice clear process, but unfortunately that's not really how my brain works, so we get this jumping around instead. I think this did make them look way better, and the gold screw inserts helped tie it together with the same parts I'd used on the head. Anyway, back to the task at hand, I needed to get these flippers attached. The angles here made it really hard to weld, and I kept thinking a position was good until I bent it and realised it wasn't. The thing I was struggling with here was really finding an angle to attach where it looked good through the hinge's entire range of motion. Most importantly, the two endpoints. This was really an issue because turtles' joints don't work like a hinge here, so I was struggling to find something that looked natural. I was getting pretty close here, and I liked this position, but managed to snap it off by accident when testing it.
Fuck.
The good news was, now that I was on the right track, it was easier to replicate. I was confident this was going to work, so I added another nail in to start the process of securing the flipper in place. Now that it was solidly attached, I could check the range of motion more easily. And it was bad. This still wasn't right, and now I'd actually stuck it there well enough that it would be a pain to remove. But I'm no quitter, so I undid my work and decided to change up my approach. I added a second nail to the body so that instead of trying to attach it to one, I'd have two to rest against, which should make it easier. Which it actually did. I managed to get it welded in at an angle I liked on the first attempt here. Well, first attempt seems like a lie given there's been like 10 attempts, but you know what I mean. I repeated the process on the other side and also managed to get it to match on the first try, which the universe didn't like, so I had to retry.
Brilliant.
But got it on my second go instead. Okay, scratch that. Third time's the charm. Being much more careful than before, I gave this one final look before going to town on this guy with the welder. Having just broken a flipper off twice in a row as taking no chances here, made things as strong as possible, adding in extra supports to make sure neither one would be going anywhere.
Oh my god.
In my very biased opinion, I thought this was looking really cool and I loved the movable element to it. Now, I know you guys want me to build something that moves via the powers of electricity, and I promise I am working on it. Someday soon you'll see a video where I can press a button and one of these guys flaps his wings, shakes his tail, or something along those lines. But for now, this is the best you're going to get. With the front flippers attached, we are so almost done. By now, all the tricky stuff is finished and it's kind of the home stretch. I threw this part onto the neck to add a bit more structure and a few more of those gold coloured screws to keep the piece looking consistent. But now it's time for the last real bit of building, the back flippers. The template I'd made wasn't great, so I whipped up a slightly more accurate one and got started building out the structure at the bottom of the shell, so like with the rest, I'd have some metal to attach the flippers to. This welded on nice and easily at this point, as I already had a good bit of scaffolding built up and really helped round things out, I felt. I grabbed all the parts I thought would work for the flippers and started arranging them on the template to fit. This looked pretty good, so I started welding them on one by one, checking with the body as I went to make sure nothing was looking glaringly bad. These were significantly easier to make compared with the front flippers, thanks to them being much smaller and simpler, and I pretty quickly had two whipped up. The only slightly difficult decision I had was what angle to attach these at, but after playing around a little, I had something I was happy with. Thanks to the attachment points I'd added earlier, they were easy to weld on, and after checking each one looked good, I started building up the strength as usual and adding all the extra connections.
This thing's heavy.
I was very tired by now. I don't think I'd left the studio before 3 AM for the last week straight, so seeing this all start to come together was a pretty amazing feeling. Everything was attached, everything looked pretty good, and there was nothing really left to build. I did want to throw in a couple of extra bits onto the back flippers though. A couple of the gold screws that dotted the rest of the piece, and a bit of wire that I threaded through the bottom of the almost gill-like parts. I got you again. That's gotta be tough to take. Look, I reckon if you subscribe right now, that would be a really good way to just stick it to me. Once I'd welded some washers on, as well as the wire, I chopped down the screws so I could super glue their heads in place. Despite being some really tiny additions, these massively helped the look of the lure flippers and left me with only one thing to do. This is always my favourite part. Adding the colour just seems to really bring the piece to life. I get these parts from circuit boards that I take apart, and obviously they're not made of metal, so I can't weld them in place. I'm using super glue and sanding them down so they have more surface area in contact with the metal. I've got a ton of these parts and felt they mimic the scaly look turtles have, so I'm just placing them in grooves and making sure there's some good variation in the colours, trying to get as many different shades of green in there. I also threw in some gold highlights because, well, they look cool. Speaking of cool parts, this camera component is amazing and I really want to include it somewhere. But the neck just didn't feel like the right spot, so I carried on working on the head. I did a similar thing on the flippers, using some metallic looking parts as well as the green ones I'd been using on the head. It's always tricky to decide what's too much when I'm doing this, as it's easy to get carried away when the parts you're using are so cool. I actually had to grab a couple more green resistors from a circuit board I had lying around, as they were a great shape to fit in exactly where I wanted. I thought I'd lower the desk down to get a different camera angle here for you guys, but this backfired as all you really got was some close-up shots of my ear. Like, really close. The bottom fins were much smaller, so I didn't need as many components and barely took any time tool as a result. This was pretty much completely done now, but I wanted to add a couple final pieces, so I welded 2 of these chips to each arm, which actually made a really big difference to it. And then, finally I found the spot for the camera component, and it was done. This piece was incredibly stressful, probably one of the hardest deadlines I've had to hit, but I'm so happy with how it turned out. Let me know what you guys think of it and what you'd like to see me make next. I've got some cool builds on the way, so subscribe if you want to stay tuned. And as always, a huge thank you to my Patreon subscribers for helping support my work. Catch you in the next one. Bye.